Life is full of disappointments. They abound in our youth, they abound in old age. I can remember as a high school teen dreaming of the day when I would go to the prom. Buying the dress was the prevailing fantasy, along with the shoes, the corsage, you know the drill. But when my time came, one problem. No one asked me. So my father, who was a pastor, conspired with the church secretary to have their AFS student from Afghanistan take me to the dance. How could he say no under those circumstances? Well, Kiam had had the terrible misfortune of having fallen in love with his American brother's girlfriend. So the poor guy consented. She wasn't going to go with him, but he spent the entire night dancing with his face 180 degrees from where I thought it should be. He stared at that girl the entire evening long. And the next day, had anyone asked him the color of my dress, I think it fair to say that he would not have had a clue. Although I wouldn't be surprised if he still remembers the color of hers. Such it was. Disappointment during the golden years. That's not hard to illustrate either. Think about Moses. Here for 40 years, he gave his life to leading his people to freedom. And it wasn't easy. Those people were cantankerous, ungrateful, selfish. But Moses forges ahead anyway. And finally, he's almost there. He makes it to the top of Mount Nebo, where he can look out over the promised land. And God then says, I shall let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over. And then Moses dies. This morning I'm going to focus on disappointment. On those disappointments that come in between youth and old age. The kind of disappointment whose ramifications can be ongoing. When what you'd like to do is to forget about them, you discover you can't. I'm thinking specifically about those disappointments related to bad marriages or to the ache of no marriage at all. I'm thinking about disappointments related to one's children or to the disappointment of not having children in the first place. I'm thinking about those disappointments related to one's employment or not having a job at all. There is no shortage of examples of people who have felt cheated by life and sometimes by God. So, how does one respond? First, probably on some level, with anger. The psalmist who wrote Psalm 25 speaks for many. Listen to this. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and bring me out of my distress. There's no pleas there. Those are commands. Consider my affliction and my trouble. In other words, the psalmist is saying, life is not fair, God. The psalmist seems to be asking that question we ask from time to time. Where is the justice? And I think that justice struggle stems from a basic sense of entitlement, which we are all familiar with. You remember the angst of Job. He wants an explanation for his suffering from God. And God answers him with a question. That reminds me of that famous story of the rabbi who was asked by a disciple, "Rabbi, why do you always answer a question with a question?" To which the rabbi responds, "Why shouldn't I answer a question with a question?" God answers Job by asking him a question, and that is, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." It would seem to be there's a disconnect there, but there really isn't. Some people respond to disappointments with guilt, and sometimes it's a deep and irrational sense. This that happened is related to something that I did, or maybe that I failed to do. I'm the one at fault, and now God is punishing me for it, and he won't let up. But regardless of the dynamics, whether it be anger or guilt, there is still one huge battle that's worth waging. And that is, I quote, "the tyranny of the dream." The tyranny of the dream. That's a phrase coined by Daniel Levinson, who wrote that classic book years ago entitled "The Seasons of a Man's Life." But that phrase says it all. How do we break loose from that tyranny? One of the most obvious ways is to lay hold of a new dream. I know that's easier said than done, but it is not impossible. Yet in order to do that, first a kind of surrender is required. And this is how one person expressed it. He said, "I surrendered. I gave up the illusion that the circumstances of my life were under my control," which was a cherished but dangerous notion I had held on to for a long time. I can remember while we were in Pepperell getting a call from a woman in the hospital telling me that their long-awaited baby daughter had just arrived. She was born with Down syndrome, and nothing, not one of the many pre-birth tests she had taken, prepared them for what at that time seemed to be life's cruelest blow. She told me, sounding as if she were trying to convince herself that the baby didn't look as if she had Down, so maybe hers would just be a mild case. But it wasn't. 2 years later, this same mother sent me a beautiful piece called "Welcome to Holland." This is how it goes. When you are having a baby, it's like planning a fabulous vacation trip to Italy. You buy a bunch of guidebooks and make plans. The Colosseum, Michelangelo's David, the gondolas in Venice. And after months of anticipation, you pack your bags and go. But then, several hours later, the plane lands. The stewardess comes from the loudspeaker and says, "Welcome to Holland." Holland, you say? I want to go to Italy, not Holland. I'm on the wrong plane. But, she says, there's been a change in plans. We've landed in Holland, and this is where you will stay. So now you have to go out and buy new guidebooks, and you will learn a new language, and you will meet a whole new group of people you never would have met otherwise. Holland is different from Italy. It's less flashy, but after you've been there for a while, you catch your breath, you look around, and you begin to discover Holland. Windmills, tulips, and Rembrandts. And then she writes, most all of your friends are busy coming and going from Italy. And they are all bragging about what a wonderful time they're having there. And for the rest of your life, you will say, yes, that's where I had planned to go. And the pain of that, admittedly, will never, ever quite go away, because the loss of that dream is a significant loss. But if you spend your life mourning the fact that you didn't ever get to go to Italy, you may never be free to enjoy the very special, the very beautiful, the very lovely things about being in Holland. The best advice I know when life's disappointments face us is to exchange the old longed-for ideal with some kind of a new dream that captures your heart and your soul. And that's a wonderful way to break free from the tyranny of the dream. But if that's not possible, we can still break free of it in the same way that the Apostle Paul did. I have no idea as to whether or not Paul had dreamt of being married, settling down, having a family. I don't know of the career dreams that Paul held for himself or how tightly he held them. That we don't know. Yet we do know of his deep disappointment in several significant personal relationships with Demas, his fellow worker, whom he later described as Demas who forsook me. We know of John Mark, who was game to go on the first missionary trip, but then had a change of heart and wanted out. We know of the ensuing and permanent rift that developed with his beloved friend Barnabas, John Mark's uncle, who desperately wanted Paul to give his nephew a second chance. But Paul couldn't find himself in it to do it. Paul knew what it was to face personal and deep disappointment. Yet those disappointments never defeated Paul because of his uncompromising trust in the love of God, his certainty of the love of Christ for him, for Paul, but also Paul's love for Jesus. And that love that enabled him to so want Jesus' vision to be realized. There's no power stronger than that personal love, not Christ's love for us or our love for him. That's the love that dispels darkness and that casts out fear. And so psychologically, Paul was able to turn away from focusing on his disappointments so as to be freed to open himself up to realize Christ's hope, to make beautiful things happen for Jesus. And the passage I read as today's text is a perfect illustration of that fact. Paul writes, I have learned to be content with whatever I have. And I love that statement because for me, the comforting part is that his inner peace wasn't always there. He wasn't born a saint. He wasn't born with the gift of acceptance. But he's saying that he, like the rest of us, had to learn not to be ruled by the tyranny of his dreams. How did he do it? He did it through surrender, by being empowered by Christ. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Not by luck, not by pluck, but by the empowering strength of Jesus' love. There it is, the message of the gospel, the message that Paul died to tell, the amazing love of Christ, and the way to be content with what life brings. Thanks be to God. Amen.